Now, Bani, I'd like to know what you think were some of the obstacles and, even more importantly, the victories that came out of this 4-year process to pass the resolution.
Well, for one, it took a long time. We didn't ever think that it was going to be 4 years later that we'd see any result. We would each year work through the process. The President of the General Assembly would appoint co-chairs to spearhead the whole process about system-wide coherence, and we would regularly meet with them and meet with member states and try and get some sort of a resolution by the end of the year. And we found that each year we get so close, and we'd move 2 steps forward, but not quite to the finishing line. And so I think the length of this process, but knowing how things work at the UN, the process is slow and deliberate. And I think that was a little bit of a challenge for us, because we'd get all excited about something that might happen, and it didn't. And so we had many, moments of disappointment, because we thought we were moving forward and it didn't quite seem that way. There's also a lot of changeover. The representatives of member states. So in part, I think some of the work we were doing was to really be going and briefing member state delegations as to what's happened thus far, and also advocate for why the entity should actually come to be. So I think those are some of the ones. I mean, and also, not all of the 4 entities that are being joined here into one, were totally on board. So it was hard for us to really advocate for this. But in terms of victories, I think the very fact that it's happened has been amazing, and the support we've received from NGOs across the board. Charlotte and Rachel both represent women's organizations. I represent the Baha'i international community, and while the advancement of women is a very important principle for Baha'is globally, we are not a women's organization per se. And likewise, there have been human rights organizations, development organizations, men and women around the world that have been really supportive of this effort and have worked actively with us in the trenches to make it, to realize this dream. And while we're very cautious, we're not quite there yet, because we've only gotten the resolution. We have to really see this entity come into fruition, but we think it's a real victory at this point that we are here.
I would just add to that I think this is really an example of the new role of civil society, and civil society. This really is a civil society-led initiative. The UN would never have done this without the initiative of civil society. And I think what Bani said, I want to emphasize as one of the successes. It was the coalition. It was bringing together women's organizations with human rights, with development, with other progressive groups to talk about how we wanted to shape the work on women. And part of the challenge of that was also to make sure that we brought together women who worked in women's movements with women's work in other places. And I think this is really a new development that will also be reflected, hopefully, in the new entity when it's created.
Wonderful. Now, Rachel, would you like to say a few words about your hopes in terms of how this new entity, UNWOMEN, will involve civil society moving on?
Well, I think UNWOMEN, as Charlotte has said and Bani have both expressed, is that civil society really pushed for this entity. So I think the civil society involvement is really integral to the success of the entity. If it's not for civil society, then we really need to, working with the women on the ground is really working with civil society. So that's where the entity needs to really become more involved with civil society and really understand the importance and the need of bringing civil society, because we are the women's movement. We are what is going to drive the entity to really achieve what it can achieve, the goals that it can realize. And civil society involvement is crucial to the success of this entity.
Wonderful. Now, Charlotte, the search is on for the Undersecretary General, And I'd like to know, and I'm sure the viewers would too, what you hope for in a USG.
Well, you know, we're looking for Wonder Woman, of course, because we want someone who has a vision of what women can achieve and need to achieve in the 21st century, and can lead the effort of the UN to realize some of the many promises. We have wonderful documents in the UN on women at the CEDAW Convention and Beijing platform. So we want someone who really has a sense of how to implement that vision, who has the vision, who has some global understanding of women everywhere, as well as what it means on the grassroots, and who also is patient and able to work through UN bureaucracy. This is not the easiest work in the world, to build that entity. In the past, one of the problems with the women's work is that it tended to be fragmented. And we now have gender mainstreaming in lots of the agencies of the UN. So this person will symbolically lead the effort on bringing together a more coherent and visible women's rights perspective into everything that the UN does. So we have done criteria as the GEAR campaign. We drew up criteria in which having expertise in gender equality and some knowledge of the history of this movement is, of course, our #1 criteria, I think. Secondly, some sense of both what it means to work at the ground and what it means to work globally, which is not always easy, but the global and the local is critical to this. And thirdly, the ability to work in a large organization like the UN requires the ability to mobilize resources, to be able to advocate for women within these structures, to manage the staff, and we're looking for someone who can bring all of those things together in an effective way and be the voice from the UN for women's rights.
That sounds great, and I think you've actually touched on a little bit on how this entity will be different, just by talking about, you know, the new facets and aspects of operation. Do you have any other words on how you think beyond the operational consolidation of the previous entities, how things would be different with this new entity? And please feel free to throw in a few words.
Well, I'll start and then I hope the others will add, because it's a very important question. Our goal, our vision is not just to bring the 4 existing things into one room and have them just do what they did before. It's to go beyond that. The existing women's entities, 3 of the 4 were very small. UNIFEM was a little bit bigger, but UNIFEM was not at the table of decision making at the country level or in headquarters. So one of our first things will be different is that we have an Undersecretary General, which is a level of visibility and power in the UN system, so that we want the agenda of women's rights to be at the table of all of the policy making of the UN. And we want that to be true at the country level as well. So the entity will be and must be bigger. It's not only consolidated, but it must be bigger and stronger. We see it as working at a higher level, and we also see it as being able to work more effectively with the rest of the UN system, so that part of it will be creating things for women that are specific to the entity, but part of it will also be bringing together and coordinating more effectively, say, the work on violence against women that's being done by UNFPA, that's being done by UNDP, that's being done by UNICEF, and so that effort, it's not that they won't continue to do their work, but that there will be greater coordination and therefore synergy and a more effective implementation.